The following series is meant as pure fan fiction, and in no way does it share the views of anyone else or those involved in this story. Before watching this video, please go back and revisit all previous videos from the 90s, as they are essential to the story that we have arrived at by this point. We will start this video with a quick recap of the year prior, 1998. In the beginning of the year, Cobain's new group, consisting of himself, Michael Stipe, and Mark Lanegan, would release its debut album on Cobain's independent label, Sellout. The new album would be titled Relevant, stating that the trio are still relevant. It would release to lukewarm sales and would die off in the charts within a few weeks, but would garner a cult following. Cobain would never return to this group, and it would be considered a one-off by all members of the trio. Kurt Cobain would arrange a meeting with Courtney Love, to be the first time they would meet in nearly 4 years. Courtney wouldn't be present for this meeting, and Cobain would ultimately find his way into the Lake Washington house. It is here that he will be able to gather his old tapes left behind in the divorce, presumably left untouched by Courtney since Kurt was gone. It is, however, unclear at this time if Courtney would retain some of those old tapes. When leaving the house, Kurt would decide not to leave Frances Bean in Courtney's care, and he takes her back to LA with him. Kurt would spend much of the beginning of 1998 hanging out with Mark Lanegan and Dylan Carlson, his old heroin buddies. Around this time, Cobain has started seeing PJ Harvey. The relationship started with business, but ended in romance, with the two seemingly falling for each other after the first few meetings. Later in the year, Cobain begins being taunted and threatened by strange people coming to his house. Kurt believes this to be Courtney, trying to pull scare tactics on him in retaliation. In the midst of all this, Kurt mistakes a fan for an intruder and shoots the fan in the leg with a shotgun. Kurt ultimately goes to trial in October, and the court rules in his favor due to the shooting happening on private property. Courtney puts the Lake Washington house up for sale at the end of 1998. All through 1998, Kurt has been working on new music. He uses his old tapes he collected from Courtney as inspiration. He plans on creating a new solo album along with working on PJ Harvey's new album, as well as various other side projects. We last left off in December of 1998, with Mark Lanegan and Dylan Carlson spending time at Kurt's place, writing and recording music. Although none of this music would ever see the light of day. A lot of it was Dylan putting in his 2 cents over Kurt's music, while Kurt and Mark both nodded off from whatever different drugs they were on. Dylan was on drugs too, but he was usually more alert. Mark Lanegan was sloppy in his cleanup when he went to do heroin in Kurt's bathroom. Later that same night, Kurt would be the one to find the cap from the syringe. He knew exactly what it was and where it was from. This would explain Mark Lanegan's prolonged disappearance from the studio. In the early hours of the morning, Mark and Dylan are completely passed out on the couch and on the floor of the studio. Kurt immediately flicks on the lights and flips out. He's not mad that someone was doing heroin in his bathroom. He's mad they left behind evidence of drugs, knowing damn well how against drugs his new girlfriend PJ Harvey is, and that they are lucky Kurt found the cap and not her, or his relationship could be over. He was mad about the blatant neglect and disrespect for Kurt's past addictions and the fact that he was still working on overcoming the drug, and is still having a hard time with it. Kurt assumes it's Dylan because he still believes Mark is clean at this time. Cobain begins to yell at Carlson until Lanigan gets up and admits it was him who was the culprit. It wasn't Dylan's fault. Dylan doesn't do heroin as much as Mark. He doesn't need it every second of the day like Mark does. Kurt is very visibly upset by this news and told Mark that he should, quote-unquote, should have told me about it when it first happened. Mark would explain that he didn't want Kurt to know, and they didn't even want the mere mention of heroin to be around Kurt. A soft argument ensues, and it is decided that Mark is going to leave for the night and stay at a hotel until he can fly back to Seattle in the morning, with Mark stating, quote-unquote, hey man, if you don't want me here, I'm out. Dylan would join Mark on the journey back to Seattle. He would also leave with Mark and join him at the hotel, where they will presumably do more heroin. Kurt is disappointed about all of this. He's mad Mark lied to him and said he was clean. They've been through so much together. They wrote, recorded, and released Relevant with Kurt believing Mark was clean. Lanigan was very good at hiding it. Kurt could spot a junkie from a mile away. This makes Kurt further question the trust he has for Mark. This brings us to 1999. The Cobain trial in October 1998 has been all over the news and different media outlets, with many believing the fan deserved it for being on Kurt's private property and taking photos of his house, presumably to sell to various media outlets and to invade Cobain's privacy. January 1999. Kurt spends much of January recording new music in his home studio outside of LA. He hasn't heard from Mark Lanigan since the incident in December of 1998. He has contacted Dylan a few times, but only got an answer once. To Kurt, it seems like heroin is more important to them than he is. But Kurt knows he was like that when he was on heroin too. He doesn't even want to think about it at this time. PJ Harvey has also been back and forth between London and LA in the US. Kurt has yet to fly out to London. It has been Harvey doing all the traveling, but that's fine with her. She has friends in LA and enjoys spending her time at Kurt's house, which she, quote-unquote, absolutely loves, due to all the artwork and the feeling that this house itself, inside and out, is an art piece of its own only someone like Cobain could have. She's never experienced anything like that, or anyone like Kurt for that matter. He's truly one of a kind to her. The concept for Cobain's album begins to take shape, with many different names for the project as well as the album itself being conceived all through January of 1999. Cobain even considered calling the project Nirvana, but he would eventually decide not to. He didn't want to get people's hopes up and, quote-unquote, sell millions of records again. So he elects to just use his own name to let people know this version of him still exists. He doesn't necessarily need to be in Nirvana. He feels like there's too much baggage attached to that name now. Too many hard times, too many overdoses, and potential deaths. He wants to be Kurt Cobain, to let people know he wrote this music. Cobain's initial plans were to make a softer album, something in tune with the likes of Dumb, or Polly, or even Burn the Rain. He still decides to include some songs of this nature on the album, but there's a huge part of Cobain that still urges to play something hard, and to smash a guitar or two. He was just burned out during the early 90s, with the extensive tours and heroin use, along with the ongoing fights with his wife, Courtney Love. He's away from all of that now, and the chains are off for Kurt creatively. He doesn't have to make one kind of music. He can do whatever he wants, and release it to the world in whichever way he pleases. While recording some of these new songs, Cobain has the idea to release a double album. one half soft songs and the other half featuring more of a harder tone, the likes of something Nirvana would release in the early 90s. Still no title for the album, and no artwork concept. But at this time, Cobain has a full brain of fresh ideas. Almost like a second wind. The first time he's actually felt creative since before Nirvana ended. He attributes this to his newfound love of PJ Harvey. He doesn't really consider himself sad anymore. Dylan finally starts calling Kurt back, stating his regrets about the situation back in December of 1998. He explains to Kurt that he shouldn't blame Mark for what happened, and that Mark was keeping his heroin use away from Kurt for his own good, to keep him away from relapsing. Kurt apologizes to Dylan and says that he will call Mark and let him know he's not mad. Although, Kurt doesn't actually call Mark. By this time, in late January of 1999, Kurt Cobain is alive and well. His hair is growing back to lengths we are used to seeing. He's becoming himself now. He will be 32 in just a couple weeks. It's hard to imagine Kurt at 32 in our real timeline. We just don't have enough of him to go by. He wasn't around long enough to really show us what 5 more years could have been. We can only go by speculation. We can only use our imagination. But it's safe to say if Kurt didn't die in 1994, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about him like this. We wouldn't have to. On January 25th, 1999, Eminem's My Name Is released. In the music video for the song, Eminem would parody various artists and celebrities including Bill Clinton and Marilyn Manson. However, in this timeline, the video features Eminem dressed as Kurt Cobain, holding a pellet gun and shooting at fans standing at the end of his driveway. Cobain never responds to this music video. By this time, in 1999, Dave Grohl and Foo Fighters are writing and recording their third album. Dave Grohl hasn't spoken to Kurt Cobain since 1996. He hasn't spoken about Nirvana since 1997. It's not looking like Kurt and Dave will ever reconnect at this point. But since no public mention of Dave on Nirvana's behalf, or vice versa, it's hard to say what the future holds. But at this time, it's not looking likely. February 1999. Cobain begins to contact lawyers for a potential custody battle for Frances Bean. He really doesn't want to have to put his daughter through all of this, but he blames Courtney for it, not himself. He would joke with friends that if he is granted custody of Frances Bean, then maybe he could quote-unquote finally leave America and join his new beautiful bride in England. It is known that Kurt and PJ are not married, but it is clear to many he can see a future with her. All through these last couple years, while away from Seattle and living in a town outside LA, Kurt has made a few new friends from small-time local bands around the area. He would often go to dive bar shows around town just to, quote-unquote, check it out. He was often recognized and made a few friends who didn't treat him like a rock star or, quote-unquote, beg for money. These people we would never know in our real timeline, but this further drives the fact that Kurt isn't just some loner. He was when he first got the house, but things changed over time, and he started to peek around town more. Not purposely making himself known, but just to see what was happening around town and to, quote-unquote, get out of the house. Kurt is surprised at home by members of Sonic Youth, who flew down to surprise him on his birthday. PJ Harvey is present, as well as Frances Bean. It's at this time that Pat Smear shows up at the door, knowing it's Kurt's birthday. Along with him is none other than Chris Novoselic, who Kurt hasn't seen since that impromptu Nirvana jam in September of 1997 in Seattle. Patty Schemmel would arrive later in the night, with Kurt, Chris, Pat, as well as PJ and Patty jamming and recording a version of All Apologies. Frances Bean is almost 7 years old and stays up way past her bedtime. This is family to her. These people making this beautiful music is what she will come to know as family. March 1999. Kurt is home one night watching MTV. A commercial for a new VHS collection about the grunge movement in Seattle in the early 90s comes on the television. In this commercial, it shows members of Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, Kurt himself, as well as Alice in Chains and Layne Staley. This makes Kurt begin to think about Layne. After hearing about the struggles Layne Staley is going through from a few mutual friends of his, Kurt makes a conscious effort at giving Layne a call. Although at this time he does not pick up the phone. Kurt knew Layne was still badly into heroin. It's a tough topic for Kurt to tackle. Anytime it has to do with heroin, Kurt elects to stay away from the entire situation. But with this particular situation, it seems that Layne and Kurt share some very parallel issues and problems. Nirvana and Alice in Chains would both release albums in 1996. After those albums were released, both men had their own serious problems they needed to deal with. Kurt feels like he can help talk Layne into going through the same rehab program he did. It worked for Kurt, and Kurt was really far gone. It's almost a miracle he was able to get clean. If only he can get a hold of Layne. At this time, he isn't able to reach him. Kurt begins wrapping up his recording sessions for his new album he's set to release. Potentially this year if things go right. As well as finishing up some loose ends with PJ Harvey's new music. At this time, it'll be a little while before PJ returns to the US to visit Kurt, leaving Kurt alone to his own devices for the time being. The Lake Washington house is on the market now, posted at $3 million. It's prime real estate with many rich business owners viewing the home. Courtney doesn't bother to empty any of the things out of the house for the viewings. Everything is still intact, as if it's still lived in. But it's known that Courtney has been staying at hotels around LA at this time. She hates Seattle. The nanny and one of Courtney's lawyers would be responsible for the viewings. Dylan Carlson catches wind of the house still being fully decorated and intact, much like it was before Kurt left. Dylan calls Kurt and says that the two should go view the house, and Dylan states to Kurt, quote unquote, "This is your fucking chance to potentially find more recordings or other things left behind." Kurt states that he doesn't really give a shit and that he has no interest in viewing the place. He doesn't feel the need to go to the house and steal more stuff. Dylan asks Kurt what he's doing that's more important, and states that he's just sitting at home depressed making music anyway, while his girlfriend is overseas. He might as well fly out to Seattle and hang out with Dylan, and go through the old house, quote unquote, for old time's sake. Kurt explains time and time again that he has no desire to even go on the property. He states to Dylan, quote unquote, "I get chills just walking into the driveway. I must have died there in some weird alternate universe or something." The two laugh, and it is decided that it was a fun idea, but they will not be attending the viewing. Kurt, however, does elect to fly out to Seattle to visit Dylan, and to visit a few old friends and a promoter he's in talks with to do another show, out in Seattle. Something about Seattle, Kurt felt like he couldn't escape. He will fly out by the end of March. During this time, PJ Harvey is still in her hometown, away from the US, with her family and working out some music ideas. She is still in constant contact over the phone with Kurt. April 1999. 5 full years since the death of Kurt Cobain in reality. This is where we are. If Kurt didn't kill himself, or if Kurt wasn't murdered in 1994, whichever way you want to look at it, if he would have waited, this may very well be where we are. He's no longer in the mainstream. He's no longer attached to a big-time record label, eating him alive and manipulating him and his creativity, and using him as their corporate cash cow. He's no longer on heroin. He's no longer under Courtney Love's grasp. He's free. He has his own independent label and private recording studio. By now, he has done an entirely new catalog of music, collaborations, and producing projects. Kurt Cobain is still a driving force in the music industry, with a lot of artists who are in the spotlight attribute their success to the movement he started. And he is still very well respected by musicians alike. The only difference now is nobody really talks about him. Not like they did, at least. He's pretty much hidden from the spotlight, but still creating some of the most beautiful and timeless songs, some of which we have still yet to hear, and in this timeline, we may never hear. We really do have to use our imagination, as it is hard to replicate what these songs could actually sound like. Only Kurt Cobain can write them. Late April 1999. PJ Harvey arrives back in the US to spend some time in Kurt's studio, trying to finish her newest record, which will now be fully produced by Cobain. However, it wouldn't be released on Cobain's label. Harvey is still on a recording contract. She simply just enlisted Kurt as the producer for the album. She would stay at Kurt's house and work on music in the studio while she was there. May 1999. Widespread rumors start to spread all over the media. Nirvana will headline Woodstock 99. It is unconfirmed where these rumors came from and how it became such a hot topic all through the month. But the news spreads like wildfire, and it's all over MTV and Much Music, as well as tabloids and smaller local news stations. Kurt catches wind of these rumors about Nirvana headlining Woodstock. At first, he elects to just ignore the rumors. He states, quote unquote, "They'll be pissed when I'm not there." Eventually, after some talks with PJ Harvey and a call from Chris Novoselic, Kurt decides it's time, and he calls an old friend from MTV. Kurt Cobain will do a sit-down interview on MTV. He hasn't done this since 1993. He hasn't been seen in any pictures other than the cheap airport tabloid photos from 1997. And he hasn't been seen in the public eye or on television since late 1995, early 1996. This is huge news. The interview will be conducted on May 20th and aired on June 4th. At this point in time, by the summer of 1999, we have only seen or heard from Kurt a handful of times since 1994. These very specific occurrences in the media would consist of Kurt finishing rehab in 1995, as well as doing interviews with Spin and Rolling Stone. Kurt's overdose in 1996, as well as the release of Rohypnol in late 1996, with the breakup of Nirvana and being released from the Geffen contract. Kurt starting his own independent label and releasing his collaborative effort with Michael Stipe and Mark Lanegan, titled Relevant, as well as dating PJ Harvey. This will be Kurt's first time in the mainstream spotlight in a long time. During this time, Cobain would release a Jeff Buckley compilation album that he pieced together and produced himself. This would be Jeff's first posthumous release and will be released on Cobain's label 2 years after Jeff's untimely death, with the blessing from Jeff's remaining family and band, with all proceeds going to the family of Jeff. May 20th. Upon arriving at the MTV interview, Kurt Cobain walks in. He has brown hair and is looking longer than the last time we've seen him. He sits down and smokes a cigarette. It is in this interview Cobain is back in the spotlight for the first time in over 5 years. He will tackle all the topics people want to hear about, including Nirvana, the recording of Rohypnol, Geffen records, as well as the Woodstock rumors and the Columbine school shooting massacre back in April. He would also comment on things like the internet and the quote-unquote impending doom that is Y2K, although he doesn't elaborate on much. When asked about the recording of Rohypnol, Cobain would state, quote-unquote, "I mean, we tried. You know, we wanted to make that record, and it just didn't turn out the way it was intended to. I didn't want to release that record the way it was." When asked about Dave Grohl, Cobain said, quote-unquote, "I'm not upset with Dave. We don't talk. He's off doing his thing. I'm actually proud of Dave. He writes great songs. I'm happy for him, because he didn't stay with me and completely derail his career." Cobain laughs. Kurt talks about Chris and Pat and says that he's still in constant contact with them. He talks about his various projects and the new Jeff Buckley compilation he just released, as well as Relevant and what that album actually means and how it's no longer relevant. Kurt talks about Relevant for the first time publicly since its release. He explains that he enjoyed working with Michael Stipe and that it was, quote-unquote, a long time coming, stating that the two have been working on material since 1994. He says that it's a very down-to-earth album that really captures the feel of what the group was going through at the time. He doesn't mention Mark Lanegan in this interview. He then gets to the Woodstock rumors, and Kurt downright denies these rumors and states that Nirvana is gone, and quote-unquote, people have to stop hanging on to stuff. He makes it clear Nirvana will not headline Woodstock and that Nirvana would never get back together. He would joke that the only way Nirvana would get back together is as the opening act for a Pixies reunion. It's in this interview he announces that he has been working on a solo album and that he finished it quote-unquote this week. And he intends to release it sometime this year. He jokes and says the album will be titled, "I Love Myself and Want to Live," but it's shrugged off as a joke. Cobain just came up with it right there. The album is still yet to be titled. It is not explained if it will be released as Kurt Cobain or under some other obscure name he comes up with. But as far as everyone is concerned, the music is finished, most of which was written and recorded all throughout 1998, as well as 1999. He states that the album will feature Patty Schemmel, the former drummer of Courtney's band Hole, as well as Pat Smear. He would also go on to say that the album would feature a number of collaborations, such as Beck and Sinead O'Connor. A few songs feature riffs delivered by Buzz Osborne of the Melvins. He would also state that PJ Harvey is involved in the writing and recording process of this album as well. Although in this interview, Kurt completely downplays the potential reunion of Nirvana, saying that it will more or less never happen. This interview does, however, build hype around this new solo venture. This new album will be the talk of the town, being reported and speculated on by MTV from this point forward until its eventual release at a later date. Nirvana fans can't wait to get their hands on this new album. On the topic of PJ Harvey, Kurt is asked how his relationship with her came about and how it's been going. Kurt went on to say, quote unquote, "It was just a natural thing. We met in 1998. We wanted to do a project together. It was just fate, I guess." PJ Harvey is from London, so naturally, Kurt is asked what he thinks about London and the artists and musicians from the UK, as well as the influence that came from it. Kurt loved the Buzzcocks, among other bands from the area. The topic of Oasis comes up in the interview. Kurt would state, quote unquote, "At first, I liked some of the songs. Supersonic, which I thought was a step in the right direction for rock music. But I felt like the Gallaghers were a bit pretentious. Maybe Liam more so than Noel. But after more time and consideration, I realized they can't be that bad of guys. But yeah, I liked some of the songs. I've been out of the spotlight for some time now, but wouldn't be opposed to working with them in the future." At this time, Oasis has been mainstream for a few years. The interview then turns into Kurt's thoughts on the current music scene. He states that right now is the perfect time for him to release new music, because he believed that there is far too many good bands out there for him to be quote unquote assaulted by the press. He says with the amount of good new bands out on the scene, anything he releases can easily be overshadowed. He goes on to say that's a good thing, and that's quote unquote what he wants. Kurt is asked what he thinks of bands like Silverchair and Bush. He scoffs and states, "I can't take any credit away from people who are good at their instruments, but the music just isn't there. I feel like those bands were hog-tied by record companies and forced to produce mediocre knockoff music to fill a void I left behind since we killed Nirvana." He doesn't elaborate any further on specific bands, but he does say that he likes that rock and roll music as a whole is changing and evolving. He says that his favorite album that has come out in the last 5 years is Steve Albini's Chicago art rock band Shellac and their debut album, At Action Park. He goes on to say that Shellac's 1994 album inspired him to create his upcoming solo record, giving fans a slight glimpse at what they might expect from the album. The Columbine school shooting massacre is brought up. Cobain states that he is very sad and isn't sure what to feel or why, but he does say that the liner notes of his new album will consist of only the names of the victims from the shooting, as well as dedicating the entire album to them. He also states he plans on putting together a benefit for the victims' families, but at this point, nothing is official. The last thing they talk about in the interview is the internet. Kurt Cobain states that he thinks it's a cool idea and a good way for fans to connect with artists. Keep in mind it's still early 1999. The internet isn't like it is now. The interview ends abruptly when Mike Patton from Faith No More happens to walk by in the studio and greets Kurt. Kurt would then say, quote unquote, "Well, time's up." He gets up and walks off with Mike Patton. June 1999. After the interview airs on MTV, Layne Staley contacts Kurt Cobain, returning his phone call from the months prior. He says that he saw him on MTV and was really glad to see him doing well. It's at this time that Kurt talks to Layne about his addictions and how he overcame it. and how it is still a huge issue in his life, but with the proper help, it can be done. Kurt sets up another phone call meeting with Layne, hoping to get him in contact with Exodus Rehab Facility in LA. Kurt even offered for Layne to fly out and stay at his place, maybe work on some music, much like Michael Stipe did for Kurt back in 1994. They agree to talk again over the phone and set something up. By mid-June of 1999, the preliminary custody hearings begin. Kurt never wanted to take Frances away from her mother. That was the last thing he wanted to do. But he realized how much Courtney used Frances as a tool to get what she wants out of Kurt. Almost as if she uses Frances as a bargaining chip, more so than an actual daughter. Kurt knows releasing his album in the midst of all this is going to create some very unwanted bad publicity in the press. He's hoping to keep things civil and out of the spotlight, but he knows that won't happen. Still to this day, even after 5 years since Kurt would have died in 1994, the media can't help but want a piece of him or anything he's doing. He just can't seem to escape it and feels like it's hopeless to try. Kurt decides to not release his much anticipated and hyped album until all of these proceedings are finished, regardless of the outcome. For the sake of himself, his daughter, and his career. With everything set up during the preliminary hearing, the actual trial is set to take place in September of 1999, further pushing back Kurt's intended release date. He was hoping for a fall release, but since the delayed date of this trial, it's looking more like it will be a late 1999 release, potentially in the year 2000. Kurt and Layne begin talking over the phone again. It's usually weeks between calls. Kurt knows that Layne's clock is ticking and that if they wait too long, it may be too late. Layne explains to Kurt that he has a hard time working up the need to get clean. He feels like he doesn't have it in him. Kurt explains that he felt the same way, and he even went through a divorce and various legal issues, all while getting clean from heroin. He explains to Layne and ultimately convinces him that there is, in fact, light at the end of the tunnel. Layne agrees to set up an appointment with the Exodus Rehab Facility before the end of the summer. At this point, it's out of Kurt's hands. Layne has to want to get clean. Kurt can't do it for him. Although the offer to stay at Kurt's place still stands, Layne elects not to. He doesn't want to put Kurt's life on hold to, quote-unquote, babysit him. July 1999. PJ Harvey is back and forth between her home in London and Kurt's home in the US, just outside of LA. The Lake Washington home is sold for $2.8 million, only $200,000 less than asking price. Courtney now has a financial backup plan. PJ states to Kurt that she has the desire to see New York, and that maybe one day she will move to the US and move to Manhattan, something she's wanted to do since she was young. Kurt says he'd rather move to the UK than to stay living in the US, but he's afraid and worried about the outcome of this upcoming custody battle. He is essentially trapped in the US until the proceedings are finished. They talk about selling Kurt's house or even opening it up as a full-fledged art gallery. But Kurt doesn't feel like his art is worth as much as we, the fans, think it is. So, that idea never really comes to fruition. Kurt is a very modest guy and doesn't see himself building a career off art alone. He would rather just sell his house with everything intact the way it is, to generate more income on a potential sale. But again, these are just ideas at this time. And right now he has no intentions on selling his home. Besides, it's been a few months since he's had any weirdos hanging around his property. He feels like Courtney's scare tactics may have stopped due to the preliminary hearings for the custody battle. She doesn't need to give Kurt any more ammo against her, so at this time, Courtney is off the radar. For now. In mid-July 1999, Kurt is hanging out with Chris Novoselic again. Nothing musical is in the works, but they've been talking, largely thanks to Pat Smear, who always thought that Kurt and Chris were inseparable. They've been through a lot together. It seems that their friendship is fine until the pressures of releasing new Nirvana material would evidently push them further and further apart. So none of that stuff has to happen this time around. Sometimes they talk on the phone, and others they meet up and hang out at Kurt's place. Especially now that Courtney is not in the picture. A lot of Kurt's old friends start to come around again, including Buzz Osborne, who has been in and out of Kurt's life on and off over the past 2 years since Kurt's initial separation from Courtney. She really did drive a lot of people away from him. It seems that all of Kurt's friends and family really like PJ Harvey, and that his relationship with her is quote-unquote good for him. July 23rd to 25th, Woodstock 99 happens, and Nirvana is nowhere to be seen, much like Kurt had warned his fans during his sit-down interview with MTV last month. Foo Fighters, however, is present at the festival in this timeline, although nowhere close to a headline spot. August 1999. The aftermath of Woodstock 99 is widespread news, and the event would effectively kill any plans for a future festival, largely thanks to the riots, sexual assaults, and the vandalism that took place over the 3-day span. Kurt would be noted as saying, quote-unquote, Woodstock is not what it's supposed to be. What I saw in that 3-day MTV special was nothing but capitalism and the manipulation of thousands of people and artists. An absolute joke. They should ban the entire thing. On August 15th, 1999, after being relatively safe from bad press and the grasps of tabloid spotlights, Courtney Love is pulled over on the interstate for speeding with a broken taillight. She's alone in the car at the time. Police immediately notice she seems off, so she is required to take a field sobriety test, where it is discovered she is under the influence of some alcohol and other downer medications. Her vehicle is searched and drug paraphernalia is found in the car, and Courtney is charged with possession of drugs. The exact drug found is not reported on, but it is widely speculated that the drug could either be heroin or cocaine, a very large federal offense. Courtney is arrested and her car is impounded. She is held on $30,000 bail, which she is able to pay, and she is released. But a court hearing for her charges will be held in October. These new charges will potentially hinder her chances in the custody battle, which is set to take place in September. The news of her arrest is widespread and all over the news, in different media sources. It's at this time that the custody battle really starts to come into focus publicly. Kurt didn't want this. He knows it'll cause nothing but bad press. He's tired of his personal life being in the spotlight all the time. Now that the custody battle has become public knowledge, a slew of different artists and fans alike come forward to give their support to Kurt, hoping he wins the battle for Francis. With the majority of the world being tired of Courtney's antics and her cocky attitude towards Kurt as well as the rest of the music industry as a whole, it's well known Kurt loves his daughter, and that he could provide a much better life for her if he is granted full custody. In the midst of all of this, Kurt has been steady with coming up with a concept for his new solo venture. So far, the album doesn't have a name, and he isn't sure if he should release it under his name or use some obscure new band name that nobody has heard, simply to keep him out of the mainstream spotlight. He isn't sure what he wants. A part of him wants that mainstream recognition, but a part of him doesn't. Kurt didn't become famous by accident. He became famous because of his careful orchestration. He lobbied to get on bigger labels and sell more records back in the early 90s. He was competitive. It wasn't until after he had the fame that he realized it's not all it's cracked up to be. But he knows now is a good time for a release due to the mainstream being so saturated with new music, especially with the explosion of hip-hop and pop music. He feels there's no way it would explode like Nevermind did. PJ Harvey suggests to Kurt he should just release it as Nirvana. But Kurt decides at this time he will release it under his own name, simply Kurt Cobain. He doesn't want to be attached to Nirvana or some obscure name. And he doesn't want his fans thinking he is solely associated with Nirvana, or that he's releasing music to please people. He wants people to know that it's just him, and that he's doing this for himself. He feels like he has to let the world know who he is, and that they should leave Nirvana in the past. He's not the corporate cash cow he was made to be in the early 90s. Cobain at this time still decides to hold off on the release until at least after the September court hearing, regardless of if he wins or not. September 1999. The official custody battle court proceedings begin, with Kurt and PJ Harvey attending the hearings, but with Courtney not present. Her lawyers, however, try to put up a fight on her behalf. Cobain's previous overdoses in 1994 and 1996 are brought up constantly in an attempt to persuade the judge into ruling into Courtney's favor. Courtney's overdose in 1994 would often be brought up as well. But it is known that Courtney's recent arrest really hurts her chances, seeing as how Kurt has been clean the last few years, and the topic of Kurt's overdoses is almost immediately thrown out, with it being well known that Kurt is more mentally and financially stable than Courtney. The mention of Kurt's new album is brought up in court, with it being said that this album will bring quote-unquote a new form of wealth to the Cobain family, whereas Courtney's band Hole has more or less disbanded since the release of their last album, Celebrity Skin, back in 1998. At this time, it is decided that the court will recess until October, after Courtney's hearing, with Cobain receiving temporary custody over Frances while Courtney can prepare for her upcoming legal battles and drug charges. Cobain is expected to return to the courtroom in late October to finalize the hearing. This is not what Kurt wanted. He wanted all of this to be over so he can move on with his life and his career. But now it looks like he will have to wait even longer. October 1999. Kurt is contacted by Oasis manager, who tells Kurt Noel Gallagher is interested in meeting him and speaking to him. Kurt accepts the meeting, and a date for the two to meet will be determined sometime in the future. Nothing is said about Liam at this time. It is simply just in Noel's interest at the time. It seems that the sit-down interview with MTV Kurt did in May, that aired in June, really struck a chord with a lot of artists, and showed them that Kurt is still very much alive and well, and that he is still a very talented person that a lot of artists would love to work with. Especially now that the shackles are off, and Cobain can virtually do quote-unquote whatever he wants, with his own independent label, Sellout. PJ Harvey's newest album is released in the beginning of October, produced by Cobain, yet still released under Harvey's current record label, as she is still contractually obligated to release music under that label at this time. Kurt would still receive royalties and a percentage of revenue due to the fact that he produced the album himself. By mid to late 1999, Kurt is still steadily receiving royalties for his work on Relevant, as well as still receiving a very small check once a month from Nirvana, a small fraction of the money he used to make when the band was still fully active. But with the creation of this new label and the subsequent releases that came after, Kurt is doing fine financially. He hasn't had to worry about money like he did before Nirvana hit it big back in 1991. He's not in the position he was back in 1994, when he was hooked on heroin and on the verge of death. Unfortunately, Kurt still secretly takes downer medication, although now in lesser doses. He is also no longer on methadone. He spends most of his free time with PJ Harvey, who has no issues with him smoking marijuana and cigarettes, along with the occasional drink. She doesn't do hard drugs, and he wants to remain as close to her as he can, so he simply just doesn't have the time for heroin or the pills anymore. He's far too happy to be around her than to put her or his daughter or anyone else around him for that matter through all of that again. Courtney's court hearing begins. This time she is present. She has to be. She's about to be charged and sentenced for the substance that was found in possession from when she was pulled over back in August. During this hearing, she begs for a second chance with her daughter and that she needs help because she, quote unquote, keeps screwing up. The judge shows leniency on Courtney due to it being a high-profile court case in the media and the immense pressure of all parties. It is decided instead of jail time, Courtney is to serve 1 year mandatory in a live-in drug rehab facility to get herself completely clean of all drugs. She must then complete 300 hours of community service as well as attend group therapy meetings once at the end of every week. At the end of 1 year in the rehab facility, while attending meetings and proving to social workers that she is capable of taking care of a child, Courtney will be eligible for an appeal. She may enter into the custody battle again once she is deemed, quote unquote, rehabilitated. Kurt Cobain is granted full custody of Frances Bean for the time during Courtney's rehabilitation, and will have to reappear in court when Courtney appeals to fight for the custody of Frances once again. The judge had seen the turnaround Kurt Cobain made in his life and the continued attempts to maintain his livelihood. Cobain deemed mentally suitable and financially capable of taking care of his own daughter. Kurt didn't want any of this at all. He would have always preferred his family stay together. He just couldn't do it. The divorce was his idea and he regretted it, but as time moves forward, he regrets it less and less with every occurrence. Kurt's life really did become all about his daughter. From 1992 all the way to the point we're at now, by the late 90s, Kurt Cobain's life revolves around Frances Bean Cobain. It's not about the art, it's not about the music, it's about his daughter. Now is Cobain's chance to stop worrying about it like he has been. The anxiety has been eating him alive. He was really worried about these court hearings, and now he has at least a year before he has to worry about it again. This gives Kurt a huge sense of calming. He's happy. By the end of October 1999, Kurt Cobain is still coming up for concept ideas for his new album. He was sleeping on the couch one day in his living room, the same room that had the window smashed by those Courtney goons back in 1998. He had a really weird, presumably drug-induced dream. In this dream, he saw a long line of people up against a wall who were all receiving lobotomies from a very tall, naked man who looked like Jesus. When receiving the lobotomy, you would instantly start believing in Jesus Christ. When Kurt woke up, he knew he had to try to remember that somehow. Not even the imagery itself, but the atmosphere of the dream is what he intended to capture. Kurt then comes up with the idea. He is going to call his new solo album Christotomy. It's simply just a name, and in no way will this album include any of the imagery he saw in his dream. He just liked the name he came up with. Without the album having a release date and only one mention in an MTV interview, Cobain is billed as the opening act for PJ Harvey on Halloween night in Seattle at a Halloween party hosted by members of Mudhoney and Soundgarden. Kurt had created the show, using his label as the main sponsor. He set this show up all the way back in April when he visited Dylan Carlson in Seattle. He wanted people to see PJ Harvey live. He also didn't want to be the main focus with all the spotlight on him. But a part of him knew having his name attached to it would bring more eyes. Plus, it's Seattle. And something about Seattle just keeps pulling Kurt back to it. Like he can't escape its grasp, as much as he wants to. Chris Novoselic is in attendance but doesn't perform at the show. He would be interviewed quickly after being spotted after the show. He was noted as saying, quote unquote, "Really cool to see Kurt up there doing his thing, man. Really cool. You know, if you just leave Kurt alone and let him do his thing, we get some really great music, man." He doesn't say anything about Nirvana. He just seems overly happy to see his friend up on stage, being visibly happy. Pat Smear is on guitar for the show, as well as Patty Schemmel on drums, who in this timeline doesn't get hooked on crack cocaine like she did in the real timeline. Ben Shepherd from Soundgarden would step in to play bass for the show, although he is not featured on the album. Both Pat and Patty are featured prominently on Cobain's new album as his quote-unquote official new band. Kurt and Pat would share bass duties on the official record. There will also feature a number of collaborations that won't become apparent until the album is released. A lot of these collaborations were not known about prior to the album's release, not even hinted at by anybody involved. PJ Harvey's performance is a huge success, and the show goes down in Kurt Cobain history as a major event in his timeline, much like the Buenos Aires show in 1992, and Unplugged came to be. The performance is very beneficial for both Cobain and Harvey, with Cobain's new material leaving people in awe, with fans in attendance being reported as saying, quote-unquote, "absolutely incredible." One fan was recorded on video saying, quote-unquote, "holy fucking shit, that was Nirvana." The performance is heavily bootlegged and shared all over the internet, with bootleg versions of some of Kurt's new material being released before the album is even announced with a release date to the public. November 1999. MP3 versions of these songs that were bootlegged from the Seattle show would begin to be circulated on the internet and peer-to-peer sharing sites such as Napster, with a lot of people downloading these songs and labeling them as new demos or listing them as complete album versions. The quality of these recordings are not good. They were MP3s ripped from a bad VHS tape recording. By no means does this make the band sound good, and a lot of the songs are almost unlistenable or hard to hear. But this is the first Kurt Cobain material since Rohypnol. It's the closest thing to Nirvana that anyone has, and people are going crazy for it. The downloads are widespread and seemingly going to create a huge problem. Kurt hears about all of this and decides it's time to release his album. During talks with PJ Harvey, she tells Kurt she thinks he should wait until at least the year 2000 to release his album. She believes with the circulation of the terrible audio live recordings on Napster and all across the internet, it'll boost the initial album sales based on the need for a better quality of the songs. And that Kurt should, quote-unquote, ride the piracy wave just a little longer, so when the album comes out, the sales will be higher than he can imagine. Kurt would agree to this. He sees what PJ is seeing, and they decide that it is the better option. The longer he makes them wait, the better the sale will be, first further boosting his financial gain and revenue the album will generate, which will greatly help him since the demise of Nirvana back in 1996. This is his first major project since then, and he's already given it a test drive. People love it, and it's going to be a big deal. December 1999. After conversations with Pat Smear, they come up with an idea for the album cover for Kurt Cobain's Christotomy. It will be a mix of Nevermind and In Utero, depicting an anatomical view of a baby, much like the image on In Utero's cover, but with a baby replacing the female body. It would also be on an image painted by Cobain, which would then be pasted on top of an older Cobain painting, creating an overly bloody and almost violent image, but yet very innocent and sensitive. Cobain knows both the name of the album as well as the cover will create some controversy. He expects it, and he's prepared for it. In the beginning of December, Kurt has been staying in London with PJ Harvey. He has quote-unquote unofficially moved in. Although he flies back and forth when he needs to, he spends a lot more of his free time in the UK with Frances. He has the chance to show her more of the world, away from the United States. However, they are both still citizens of the United States. And Kurt still has his home and private studio just outside of LA. By the end of December, Kurt is gearing up to release his much-anticipated solo album, with the bootleg songs still being heavily circulated across the internet. The release date will be January 15th, 2000. Kurt's first major release since Nirvana's Rohypnol in 1996. Commercials and ad promos begin to air on MTV. These consist of bright white screens with screeching feedback noise over the imagery. The screen begins to fizzle out into static as the screen is splashed with a thick red substance, presumably blood, with very small sneak peeks of melodies and choruses from some of the songs playing over the video, with a very ominous voice that says, Kurt Cobain, Christotomy, January 15. These would air every couple hours on full rotation on MTV and Much Music. The hype for this album is massive, with the release having the potential of being as big as Nevermind was back in 1991, if the promotion is done properly. We will have to wait until the new millennium to find out how this album will do, and what it will sound like. Kurt Cobain spends the rest of December in London with PJ Harvey and Frances Bean. This will conclude If Kurt Cobain Lived, 1999. We hope you enjoyed listening, and please stay tuned for If Kurt Cobain Lived, 2000. Please join us in the new millennium.